L'honorable député de Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier.
The honourable member will have 5 minutes of questions and answers when we come back from question period.
Statements by members. Déclaration de député. The honourable member for Whitby.
Mr. Speaker, last week in my riding of Whitby, our fire and emergency services held their recruit graduation ceremony. It was an incredible event that recognized the 9 new Whitby firefighters who took the oath of service, affirming their commitment to protect our community. Firefighters are essential to our country, and without their service, Canada could not be the safe place it is today. These national heroes who risk their lives every single day deserve our support, which is why our government has invested over $900 million to train firefighters for disaster financial assistance and to support the work of Indigenous Services Canada. I would like to take this opportunity to also recognize the dedication and service of Captain Bob Brandon, who has trained many recruits and is retiring this August. From the new graduated firefighters to the many who have served in our community, we thank you, Captain Bob, for your many years of service and your countless contributions to our community.
Well done. The honourable member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Mr. Speaker, the Isabel Cup is the championship trophy of the Premier Hockey Federation. It takes its name from Lord Stanley's daughter Isabel, who shared his love of the game and is known as one of the first female hockey players in Canada. Isabel encouraged her father to purchase a silver cup to be awarded to the best amateur hockey team in Canada. This cup later became the Stanley Cup. Another terrific and talented Canadian hockey player is my niece, Brittany Howard, who has brought the Isabel Cup here to Ottawa to share with us all. Britt was a standout player at Robert Morris University, a Division I program in Pittsburgh, where she received All-American honors. This past hockey season, Brittany led the Toronto Six and the Premier Hockey Federation as the top scorer with 18 goals in 24 games. The past March, the Toronto Six participated in the Isabel Cup Championship in Tempe, Arizona, after defeating the Connecticut Whalers in the semifinals. In overtime, the team defeated the Minnesota Whitecaps by the score of 3-2 to win the Isabel Cup playoff championships. This is the first time a Canadian team has won the Premier Hockey Federation. Please help me congratulate Brittany and her teammate Rachel Seeley on winning the Isabel Cup. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Diplomats play a key role in strengthening the socio-economic, political and trade relationship between their country and Canada. I would like to recognize and thank High Commissioner of Brunei to Canada, His Excellency P.G. Kamal Bashash Ahmad, who is leaving Canada after 9 years of excellent service in Canada. He is currently the longest serving diplomat in Canada and the only one still here as a diplomat since I got elected in 2015. I also would like to recognize and thank Ambassador of Vietnam to Canada, His Excellency Pham Quoc Pong, who is retiring soon. Vietnam is Canada's biggest trading partner among ASEAN countries. I would like to once again thank both these diplomats and wish them all the very best in their future endeavours. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Manicouagan.
The honourable member for Manicouagan. Mr. Speaker, as member for Manicouagan, and on behalf of the Bloc Québécois, it is with great sadness that I rise today to speak to all those affected by the tragedy in Portneuf-sur-Mer. My sincere condolences. On June 3rd, a group of adults and children were fishing together on the banks of the St. Lawrence when they were caught by the rising tide, which surrounded them and trapped them. 6 of them were rescued from the waters, but the sea returned the bodies of the 5 it had taken over the next few hours. Today, we mourn 4 children and the father of 2 of them. I pay tribute to them. To all the people of the Haute-Côte-Nord, Bergeronne, Tadoussac, and Portneuf-sur-Mer, to your parents, friends, families, and loved ones, please know that the most heartfelt thoughts of all North Shore residents are with you, as is our love. In darkness, love continues to grow and burn like a bright, strong sun. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Yukon.
Mr. Speaker, I invite my colleagues to join me in celebrating National Indigenous History Month. 50 years ago this year, a delegation of Yukon First Nation leaders journeyed to Ottawa to bring their plan for their future, Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, to present to then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Yukon First Nations have since signed self-governing agreements, marking the beginning of modern treaties and the pathway to modern nationhood. Today, Yukon First Nations are leading a cultural renaissance. Last week, I attended the annual Yukon First Nations graduation ceremony, where 129 proud and joyful graduates marched across the stage to the singing and drumming of the Dakwakan dancers. Later this month, the Adaka Cultural Festival in Whitehorse will feature the rich and vibrant cultures of Yukon First Nations and Northern Dene Nations through art, music, storytelling, and more. As we work together to heal from the wrongs of Canada's colonial past, I encourage all my colleagues to learn about and embrace Indigenous traditions and culture as critical steps in our reconciliation journey. Let us honour Indigenous history across Canada, not just this month, but throughout the year. Ganon Shish, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, a very good news for Canada. The Memorial Cup will stay in Canada because the Quebec Remparts triumphed and they got the Memorial Cup, the emblem of junior hockey supremacy. What a dream season. 76 wins in 90 games and the Triple Crown, League champions, playoff champions, and Memorial Cup champions.
And salute the Peace of Peterborough, the only team who has beaten les Remparts. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, from goalie William Rousseau to forward James Malatesta, as they say, the Remparts triumphed as a team. These players were masterfully led by the exceptional Patrick Roy. He could have taken it easy, but he gave 13 years of his time to coaching junior players. Sunday was the third Rempart Memorial Cup. We won it in 2006. We won it in 1971 with the Rempart en or, and half a century later, the flame of victory burns brighter than ever.
Il n'y en a pas au Canada, même aux États, pour nous voler notre championnat. Ils sont en or. Ils sont en or. Bravo, Rempart!
Way to go, Rempart!
The Honourable Member for Davenport.
Mr. Speaker, on May 13, 1953, a group of Portuguese immigrants arrived on a boat named Saturnia, docking at Pier 21 in Halifax. These new immigrants started the first of many waves of Portuguese to start a new life in Canada. Now, 70 years later, Portuguese Canadians are almost 500,000 strong. Living in communities right across Canada, they are builders, musicians, athletes, business leaders, chefs, teachers, and politicians, among so many other professions. Their contributions and stories have enriched Canadian society and have transformed Canada into not only a better country, but also one of the best countries in the world to live in. As a Member of Parliament for Davenport, the riding with the largest number of Portuguese Canadians, I'm proud to rise in the House today to mark the beginning of Portuguese Heritage Month in Canada. Whether it's by listening to fado, drinking vinho verde, eating a bifana or pastéis de nata, I invite all Canadians to join me in celebrating all things Portuguese this month. Feliz mês de Portugal. Obrigada, Sr. Presidente.
The Honourable Member for Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to highlight the actions our government is taking to meet the housing needs of Canadians. Since the release of our National Housing Strategy in 2017, we've leveraged over $80 billion of investment, creating thousands of new units across the country and utilizing those same investments to renovate and repair decades-old affordable housing units in every corner of the country. As an extension of this work, the Minister recently announced the Canada Greener Affordable Housing Program that will provide $1.2 billion in funding over 4 years for much-needed renovations to existing affordable housing units. The funding will allow affordable housing providers to make improvements to aging buildings that will improve energy efficiency and extend their lifespan, improving the living conditions and quality of life for tenants across the country. And while the leader of the official opposition villainizes our municipal partners, our government continues to work with municipalities and nonprofit housing providers, ensuring our housing investments improve our affordable housing stock while reducing greenhouse gas emissions and combating climate change.
Well said.
Member for Banff Airdrie.
79 years ago today, on June the 6th of 1944, the world witnessed an event that would shape the course of history. Ce jour a marqué le début de la fin de la deuxième.
That was the beginning of the end of the Second World War, and it was a major moment of pride in Canada's military history.
Canadians stormed the beaches of Normandy. By sunset, more than 1,000 Canadians had made the ultimate sacrifice in defense of our freedoms. Though the price was high, the valor of that day laid the foundation for an eventual Nazi surrender and made proclamation to the world that Canada would give no quarter to tyranny. Notre histoire démontre et notre présence.
Our history demonstrates and our presence confirmed that courageous, brave Canadians will always answer the call to defend our country and our values.
I ask every Canadian to reflect on the selfless sacrifice of the Normandy landings that was pivotal in securing the free and prosperous nation that we cherish still today. We will remember them. Nous nous souviendrons d'eux.
We will remember them.
The Honourable Member for Pickering-Uxbridge.
Samin Barakzai is a former Member of Parliament for Afghanistan, but when the Taliban took over, she was removed from office and came to Canada for safety. Her voice will not be silenced, and I'd like to share a message Samin would like us to hear. She writes, quote, "Today I write with a heavy heart, burdened by the unimaginable suffering endured by the women and girls of Afghanistan. Where dreams once blossomed and aspirations soared, the shadows of tyranny have cast a suffocating veil upon its courageous women and innocent girls. Their voices, once vibrant and filled with hope, have been silenced by a regime that seeks to strip them of their rights, dreams, and very essence. We are witnessing a significant change in Afghanistan, and it's our duty to pay attention and take appropriate actions. With Canada being a prominent leader in advocating for women's rights, I hope we continue to pursue these powerful goals and raise our voices for Afghanistan. The Afghan people need our support, and we cannot leave them alone in this struggle." End quote. Samin, your bravery and determination to never stop fighting for the rights of Afghan women and girls is truly inspiring. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, Canadians landed on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, 6 June 1944, and contributed to liberating Europe. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, which had been training in England, was called up to face Hitler's German divisions. In fact, after the surrender of France in June 1940, Canada, whose military forces were made up entirely of volunteers, became Britain's best ally. At the risk of losing their health, their futures, and, all too often, their lives, Canadians committed themselves, body and soul. Worse than the tragedy of war would be to forget their sacrifices, to forget their names, and to forget to teach our children their value. We will not forget our heroes from the Canadian units that landed on the beaches of Normandy 79 years ago. I have a special place in my heart for the soldiers of my unit, the Régiment de la Chaudière, who fought so valiantly. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division on June 6th lost 340 men. 574 were wounded and 47 were taken prisoner. If Canada is a free country, if Canada is able to defend human rights internationally, it is largely thanks to their sacrifices. Aire perennius. Let us remember.
The Honourable Member for Fort McMurray Cold Lake.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal NDP, costly coalitions, out-of-control spending, and sky-high taxes have made life unaffordable for Canadians. More Canadians are visiting the food bank than we have ever seen before. More seniors are choosing to delay their retirement just to make ends meet, and more families are finding themselves on the brink of insolvency. By every objective measure, the Liberals' war on work is making life more expensive with inflation, higher taxes, resulting in expensive gas, heat, and groceries, which leaves hardworking Canadians with less in their pockets every month. With Budget 2023, the Liberal government doubled down on these failed policies, adding over $40 billion to the national debt. Next year, Canadians will spend over $43 billion in interest payments alone. Canada's Conservatives are demanding a plan to balance the budget, bring back an end to inflationary deficits, and for the Liberals to axe the carbon tax. Only Conservatives will bring home powerful paychecks, lower prices, and make Canada work for the people who work.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Lacolle. Mr. Speaker, it is a pleasure and an honour today to mark the 50th anniversary of the Saint-Rémy Faddock Club. I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to its president, Jacques Lavigueur, and all the members of its current board of directors. I get overwhelmed, Mr. Speaker, when I think of the commitment of all of the volunteers who have succeeded one another at the helm of this organization to make it the success that we're celebrating today. Everywhere in my riding of Châteauguay-Lacolle, FADOC clubs are working hard to benefit their members. Clubs like the one in Saint-Rémy, but also in Châteauguay and in Napierville. Just think of all the volunteers who, year after year, enable their thousands of members to enjoy a wide range of activities, all just as fun as the next. Happy 50th anniversary and long live the FADOC Club in Saint-Rémy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to remind members
that statements are in progress, and we all want to hear what's being said. So I'm just going to ask everyone to whisper to each other if they're talking, but more importantly, try to listen to what everyone else is saying. The
Honourable Member.
Fanshawe.
On June 6th, we celebrate the courage of Canadians that took part in the Normandy landings with the goal to free Europe from the grips of an extremist right-wing regime. It's been 79 years since Canadian soldiers took part in the landings and where many soldiers gave their lives to build a more peaceful, just world. We must honor their fight and their sacrifice. They put everything on the line at Juno Beach so we could stand here today freely with all of the privileges we have. More than 20 years ago, I too stood on that beach and visited the cemetery at Bény-sur-Mer. I walked among the graves of those who never came home, and it was something that I will never forget. On behalf of Democrats, on the anniversary of D-Day, we commemorate the courage shown against such destructive forces. We thank the veterans and their families for their sacrifice, and we vow to hold true to the values for which they fought: justice, equality, and democracy. We will remember them.
The Honourable Member for Bécancour, Sorel. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Bloc Québécois and as Dean of this House, I'm pleased to pay tribute to Jeff Regan, Speaker of this House from 2015 to 2019. His portrait will henceforth adorn the corridors of Parliament, as is the custom. The 36th Speaker of this House and the first from Atlantic Canada in nearly a century, Mr. Regan has proudly represented the people of Halifax West from his first election in 1993 to his 8th in 2019. He served on both the opposition and the government benches. He was Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, but it is as Speaker today that he is honoured. I had the honour of presiding over the vote in which he was elected by his peers in 2015. The Bloc Québécois will remember Mr. Regan as a fair and thorough Speaker, through the occasional and sometimes less occasional turmoil that characterizes the position of Speaker. He embodied the integrity, patience, and competence required to hold that seat. That is what we will remember Speaker Jeff Regan for.
The Honourable Member for Dufferin-Caledon.
Liberal inflation is crushing Canadians. 1 in 5 Canadians are skipping meals, food bank usage skyrocketing. And what's this Liberal government response? A massive $60 billion inflationary budget deficit and carbon tax too. And we all know the sequel is way worse than the original. Carbon tax 2 will add 61 cents a litre in tax to gas, making everything more expensive. Even Liberals are shaking their heads, and not just random former Liberals this time. Former Finance Minister John Manley has said Liberal spending is making it harder to control inflation. And things are getting worse. The Bank of Canada is now signaling another interest rate hike. Canadians, don't lose hope. This Conservative government is going to fight this budget until these Liberals agree to a plan to balance the budget. And if they don't, maybe it's time to give them the boot.
The Honourable Member for Halifax West.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to celebrate the achievement of my predecessor and yours, the Honourable Jeff Regan. I first met Jeff in 1990 when I was articling and he was a practicing lawyer. We stayed in touch and our paths have crossed often. For 27 years, Jeff was an honest and dedicated representative for the people of Halifax West. He served in a number of parliamentary capacities, including as Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, and most recently as the 36th Speaker of the House of Commons. He gave so many years of his life to public service, which was made possible with the support of his wife, Kelly, kids Caitlin, Nicole, and Harrison, and his extended personal and political family. Today, Speaker Regan's official portrait will be unveiled during a ceremony on Parliament Hill, a wonderful testament to his legacy and contributions to our democracy. I'm grateful for Jeff's years of hard work to serve the people of Halifax West, us parliamentarians, and all Canadians. Félicitations.
Congratulations, my friend. Thank you.
Oral questions. Question orale. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
We learned today that David Johnston's report was not only written by a former family friend and former member of the Trudeau family, of Trudeau Foundation, but that an assistant who helped is a Liberal donor. David Johnston hired Liberal and New Democrat consultants to help with public communications. Can we finally put an end to the charade, Mr. Speaker, and trigger an actual public inquiry? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, while the Leader of the Conservatives continues his unfounded attacks against the former Governor-General and his team, he claims that he wants the real answers. All he has to do is to accept the top secret briefing that was offered to him, offered by our intelligence bodies, to understand what is happening when it comes to foreign interference. But he refuses, Mr. Speaker, to do so because he prefers to remain in the shadow of ignorance, to continue to simply do unfounded attacks, personal attacks and partisan attacks. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition
was forced to remain behind a veil of ignorance by his own admission today. He said that he was not aware of information that the former Conservative leader already knew about the government in Beijing spreading disinformation using state organs. This is on top of learning today that Mr. Johnston hired a lifelong Liberal donor who was at a fundraiser with the leader of the Liberal Party just 2 years ago. In addition to other Liberal consultants and NDP strategists to do damage control, will we put an end to the act and fire this rapporteur and call a public inquiry now?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me read a quote on the former Governor-General. I think we're dealing with a very credible individual, and I think that distant history bears little relevance to the fact that he has a very distinguished career. If we're suggesting just because at some point in history he was appointed by a former Conservative Prime Minister that he should be disqualified from participating in public life, I think that is a little bit extreme. This is a very qualified individual, and frankly, I haven't heard anybody question his integrity, and I have no reason to do for. That, Mr. Speaker, was the Leader of the Opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Order. 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 The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Which is another reason that it is so tragic that that Prime Minister has destroyed the reputation. Of the Trudeau Foundation in this terrible position and surrounding him with Liberal staffers, Liberal donors, and Liberal lawyers. He has ruined the perceived objectivity, caused a conflict of interest, one that he could reverse anytime. Why will the Prime Minister not put an end to the charade, launch a full public inquiry now?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as the Leader of the Opposition formerly said, David Johnston is a man of integrity, and when I chose to appoint him to be an independent expert, I didn't hold against him the fact that he had been appointed by Conservatives past. I knew that his judgment was top-notch, and that is what he has demonstrated every step of the way. The judgment that is in question is the judgment of the Leader of the Opposition, who continues to refuse to get briefed up on top-secret matters that would allow him to understand what's actually going on in foreign interference, instead of making baseless personal attacks.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's no longer just me that's pointing out that deficits cause inflation. It's the former Liberal Finance Minister, John Manley. He says this government is putting its foot on the inflationary gas while the Bank of Canada is slamming its foot on the brakes by raising interest rates on Canadians. There are literally hundreds of thousands of families who took on big mortgages when interest rates were artificially low that will face massive increases in their monthly payments when they come for renewal if rates don't get back down. So will the Prime Minister balance the budget to bring down inflation and interest rates so that Canadians can keep their homes?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
In the name of austerity, the Conservative Party continues to filibuster and block our measures.
I'm just going to interrupt. We're starting to build up again. Yesterday was such a nice day. I just want to repeat. Everybody can take a deep breath. And if the words are too big, then Google them. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, the Honourable Right Honourable Prime Minister, from the top, please.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party continues its focus on austerity and cuts rather than being there to help Canadians. They are blocking and using parliamentary games to hurt Canadians who need help right now. He's busy blocking an anti-flipping tax for residential properties to help out homeowners. He's blocking the doubling of tradespeople's tools deduction at a time where we know we need our tradespeople to continue delivering new housing across the country. And he's even blocking the Enhanced Canada Workers Benefit. His partisan games are hurting Canadians. When will he let BIA pass?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Families are already facing austerity, and families have to make cuts themselves into the amount of food they can eat and other activities that their families would like to do. What we are blocking is the $60 billion of inflationist deficit that has fueled interest rate rises. Even the Minister for Finance admitted that deficits put oil and fuel on the inflationist fire. Will the Honourable Prime Minister finally listen to his own Finance Minister, and will he stop to add fuel to the inflationist fire? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's just ridiculous words again. He's accusing us of austerity whilst accusing us of investing too much. That's ridiculous. Just like what the Leader of the Official Opposition is doing now is blocking measures that will help Canadians now, like an anti-flipping tax, like a measure to double deductions for tools, and against strengthening worker benefits. He voted to block dental care for children. He voted to block help for low-income renters. The Honourable Member for Belley-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, the not-so-independent rapporteur tabled a preliminary report, much to the satisfaction of the Prime Minister. To do so, he did not speak to the Chief Electoral Officer. He did not speak to the Elections Commissioner. He spoke to no one from the Chinese diaspora that have been victims of bullying and intimidation. And then, with great wisdom, he decided that a public inquiry was not necessary. Mr. Speaker, who did David Johnston actually talk to at the end of the day? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I know full well that the Leader of the Bloc Québécois looks forward to David Johnston's tour of the country to talk to the Chinese diaspora that has been affected by interference. But the Bloc Québécois is choosing ignorance on the matter by refusing to accept briefings, top-secret briefings from intelligence bodies on the content of reports and on reports from our intelligence organizations. He can continue to do unfounded partisan attacks, but he needs to read the facts. The Honourable Member for Bailleul-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, when I talked about the Prime Minister's ignorance, there was a point of order. But I think that that David Johnson talked to the Trudeau Foundation. It's better among friends, after all. I think that the rapporteur spoke to the Prime Minister, but we don't know if this was to actually do any rapporting at all. This morning, he explained that an investigative inquiry would be too long and would be too costly. It's quicker and cheaper to keep secrets at the end of the day. Mr. Speaker, was Mr. Johnson's true mandate to simply put a lid on this entire story of foreign interference? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the leader of the Bloc Québécois perhaps would be a bit more credible when it comes to keeping secrets if he were to accept information that would lead him to hear about the facts about foreign interference. He refuses to allow our intelligence officers to give him the necessary information so that he can truly understand what is happening when it comes to foreign interference. He chose ignorance. He did not choose facts. For such a serious matter, this shows us that he is not serious at all. The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
The cost of a house has exploded under this Prime Minister. If we look at the rising interest rates, that's making things even worse. Here's the situation in the city of Toronto. For someone earning $256,000 a year has to wait 25 years before they have enough money for a down payment, according to a CTV article. That is absurd. That is something very serious. When will this Prime Minister take this seriously and start taking steps to deal with this housing problem?
Yes. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we know Canadians are struggling with the rising cost of housing, whether it's a young family looking to buy their first home or a student trying to rent an apartment near campus. That's why we're taking action on so many fronts. We're helping Canadians save up for their first home. We're investing in building and repairing more homes, including supporting local governments to fast-track the creation of 100,000 new homes. We're providing support for low-income renters, and we're assuring housing is used as homes by curbing unfair practices that drive up prices, which includes bringing forward an anti-flipping tax, which unfortunately Conservatives are choosing to block for political gains instead of delivering for Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
The Leader of the Opposition would have us believe that he understands the people of Canada whilst being in a state-paid housing with a chef and a gardener. He's just there to protect the rich who are profiting from this crisis, but for ordinary people, rising interest rates are hurting, and there's even a rumour that the Bank of Canada is going to raise interest rates again. I apologise for interrupting the Honourable Member. There was an issue with a lot of noise in the House. I'm not quite sure where it comes from, but people are chatting a bit loudly today. I would like people to whisper.
If they're going to speak to each other, the noise is just starting to creep up again, and I don't want it to get out of hand. The Honourable Member for Burnaby South from the top, please.
The Leader of the Opposition would have us believe that he believes people whilst he stays in an official residence paid by the state with a chef and a gardener. He's just here to protect the rich who are profiting from this crisis, but for ordinary people, rising interest rates are hurting, and there are even rumours that the Bank of Canada is going to raise interest rates again. Does the government have a plan to reduce the disastrous impact of these rates upon the majority of Canadians? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we know that Canadians have many challenges when it comes to paying for their housing, and that is a reason for which we are acting in a number of ways. Our plan will have collaboration with municipalities by investing $4 billion, for example, to accelerate approvals and creating 100,000 new housing units. There will be ties between investments in infrastructure and housing. Our plan helps Canadians to save for their first house. It also helps low-income renters, and the Conservatives voted against. It also converts federal land into affordable housing.
Finance Minister admitted that deficits fuel inflation. It's hard to believe she even understands this concept, as her government piled on more debt onto Canadians than every government before them combined. This led to the highest bank interest rate hikes seen in a decade, and now 63% of Canadian paychecks go towards monthly mortgage payments alone. After knowing all this, she still threw a $63 billion jerry can of fuel on the inflationary fire that she started in her failed budget, and now a mortgage crisis looms. Can she tell us on what date she'll stop her inflationary spending and balance the budget so interest rates can finally come down?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite represents an Alberta constituency, and I'm sure he and his constituents, like me, are proud of Alberta's Ukrainian-Canadian heritage. But I wonder if his constituents know that the blocking tactics of these Conservatives are stopping measures in the BIA that would support Ukraine. They are preventing us from withdrawing most favored nation trading status from Russia and Belarus. That is the practical consequence of the blocking and filibustering and the partisan jockeying of the Conservatives.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
My constituents, like all Albertans, rejected this Liberal NDP government and elected a strong Conservative government just last week. And she can spare us of her Disney Plus Mickey Mouse lectures, because not all Liberals are as incompetent as this government is. Former Liberal Finance Minister John Manley said Liberal spending fueled inflation. Former Liberal Premier of Nova Scotia, Stephen McNeil, said governments continuing to spend beyond their means will only increase inflation. How come random Liberals understand the importance of balancing a budget and this incompetent Liberal government doesn't?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think it is worth ensuring that Canadians know the other vital measures which this partisan posturing Conservative opposition is denying them. This Conservative filibuster is preventing Canadians from getting advance payments of the Canada Workers' Benefit. They are blocking a crackdown on predatory lending. Who would oppose that, Mr. Speaker? They are blocking the extension of seasonal EI. Again, I'd like to know if their MPs from Atlantic Canada are aware of that and support that outrageous, appalling action.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Mill Woods.
Mr. Speaker, the Finance Minister recently said what Canadians want right now is for inflation to come down and for interest rates to fall. And that is one of our primary goals in this year's budget, not to pour fuel on the inflation fire. But that's exactly what they did, Mr. Speaker. Budget 2023 adds $60 billion of new spending. That's $4,200 for each Canadian family. That's more higher costs, higher inflation, higher taxes. When will they get their budget under control and control their out-of-control spending?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let's talk about some facts. When COVID hit, Canada suffered the deepest recession since the Great Depression. But today, unemployment is at 5%. You know what, Mr. Speaker? Under Stephen Harper, the lowest unemployment got was 6%, a full percentage point higher than it is today.
That's correct.
And you know what else, Mr. Speaker? Today, women in their prime working years, the employment rate for them is more than 85%. Under Stephen Harper, the highest that ever got was 83%. Our policies are getting Canadians back to work, Mr. Speaker. That's what they need.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Mill Woods.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, what their policies are doing is rent payments have doubled for Canadians, mortgage payments have doubled. Most young Canadians have even given up the hope of ever owning a home in Canada, Mr. Speaker. And now Canadians are concerned that the Bank of Canada will have to raise interest rates again just to keep up with their inflationary spending. So once again, Mr. Speaker, when will they balance the budget and solve this inflation crisis?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I understand why these Conservatives prefer rhetoric over facts. And the reason is that their policies led to such a lackluster recovery from the 2008 recession, which was much more mild than the COVID recession. It took Canada, after 2008, 110 months to recover to the pre-recessionary unemployment rate. After the COVID recession, just 24 months, Mr. Speaker. Things have been hard for Canadians, but thanks to our government support, people are back at work. That's what matters the most.
Louis Saint Laurent.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, you might remember one of the most bizarre statements when the Prime Minister stated that budgets balance themselves. Well, no one repeated this because it's completely ridiculous. The issue is that after 8 years of Liberal governance, the budgets have never been balanced on their own, deficit after deficit after deficit. But Mr. Speaker, here's a little secret. Last November, we thought there might be a light at the end of the tunnel. The Minister for Finance stated that they shouldn't put fuel on the inflationary fire. That means controlling expenditure. So why has she changed her mind? The Honourable Minister for Innovation. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for Louis Laurent for his question. I hope that Canadians who are watching us today will be aware that the Conservative Party today is delaying investments in clean electricity, delaying investments in clean technology, delaying investment in clean hydrogen. Mr. Speaker, are they really listening to Canadians from time to time? We are building tomorrow's economy. We're investing in the future. We're taking generational opportunities, and the Conservatives are blocking Canada from moving forward into our 21st century economy. Shame on them. The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, well, it's more shameful for the Liberals because the Minister for Industry is blocking the Minister for Finance so that she cannot answer to a question that is up to her responsibility. Perhaps there are internal struggles happening. Perhaps the Deputy Prime Minister has now realised that she is far from the mark. But everything's far too expensive nowadays, Mr. Speaker, and so a clear question, perhaps for the Minister for Finance this time. Madam Minister, why was it fire on inflationary fire? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the economy, we have to talk about facts, not merely about partisan rhetoric. And so, I would like to remind Canadians that after the tabling of the budget, S&P renewed Canada's AAA credit rating. I would also like to remind Canadians that Canada has the lowest deficit of all G7 countries. Canada has the best debt to GDP ratio in the G7. Those are facts. The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Committee, in Committee on Chinese Interference, David Johnston explained why, in his opinion, a public inquiry should be avoided. Do you know why, Mr. Speaker? Because in his opinion, it is expensive and it takes time. But, Mr. Speaker, do you know what is also expensive and time-consuming? It's more than 3 months of work we've wasted since February calling up for a public inquiry that everyone wants except the Liberals and their special rapporteur. The Liberals' resistance to shedding light on the matter is costly and time-consuming. That's what undermines public confidence. So when will there be a public and independent inquiry? The Honourable Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, you won't be surprised that I perhaps have a different opinion on time wasting. Time wasting is a leader of the Bloc Québécois that doesn't want to hear from what security officers have to say when it comes to trusted information and top secret information. Time wasting is also inviting Mr. Johnston to a parliamentary committee and spending over 3 hours with him, not to ask him questions about the very substance of foreign interference, but to ask him, or rather, spending 3 hours attacking his integrity. That is time wasting, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, what is Mr. Johnston proposing instead of a public and independent inquiry that everyone is calling for? Mr. Johnston is proposing himself. That's what he's proposing himself. He's replacing the inquiry. He is the inquiry, despite the House asking him to leave in order to hold his own hearings that are not independent at all. David Johnston, the man who does not want a public inquiry based on information he refuses to make public, David Johnston wants to control what could be discussed in public in his own hearings. Mr. Speaker, this is likely to be less expensive, less time-consuming, but it will also be far less clear. Who can claim that this is not just smoke and mirrors? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's a surprise to no one that intelligence information should be kept secret. That is exactly extant circumstances elsewhere with our allies throughout the world. Good news, Mr. Speaker. We offered opposition leaders, including the Bloc leader, access to this information so they can judge themselves what Mr. Johnston's conclusions are. But they prefer partisan games. They want to attack Mr. Johnston instead of looking facts in the eyes and understand exactly what is happening with foreign interference. The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Mr. Speaker, David Johnston has never been able to answer a simple question on the matter, nor has the government. Whether the federal government was able to hold an independent public inquiry into the case of Maher Arar involving the secret services of foreign countries. If the federal government was able to hold an independent public inquiry into the Air India bombing involving terrorist entities and foreign governments, why is it all of a sudden too complicated to do so in the case of Chinese interference in Canada, which is aimed at Canadian democracy itself? The Honourable Minister for Canadian Heritage. Mr. Speaker, if the Bloc Québécois truly were interested in what's happening in Quebec, if they were truly interested in what is worrying Quebecers right now, they would ask questions on forest fires, perhaps, because that is what worries Quebecers right now. If they were sincere about asking questions, and if they'd ask questions about fires, then I would like to say that my colleague is in constant communication with the Quebec government. Then we would have had a quick answer. We've intervened rapidly. We've responded rapidly. We'll always be here for Quebec.
Mr. Speaker, to quote former Liberal Premier McNeil, we would all benefit from all governments being able to manage their own budget a lot better. Go figure, Mr. Speaker, after this budget was released, inflation went up. After the carbon tax increased, inflation went up. The Liberals must give Canadians a plan to end their deficits and bring down spending so that we can stop inflation and interest rates. And they must cancel their carbon taxes, Mr. Speaker, that are hurting struggling Canadians the hardest. Mr. Speaker, when are they going to do this?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is really appalling that the Conservatives continue to talk down the Canadian economy. But the reality is Canada's AAA credit rating was reiterated after we tabled the budget. The reality is our economy grew by 3.1% in the first quarter of this year. We have the strongest recovery in the G7. And when it comes to inflation, Mr. Speaker, it has gone down from 8.1% last June to 4.4%. And Mr. Speaker, it is lower than inflation in Germany, in the US, in the UK, the OECD average, the EU average.
The Honourable Member for Kenora.
Mr. Speaker, what's appalling is that this government has done absolutely nothing to help struggling Canadians. We know the Liberals already have one carbon tax in place that will add 41 cents a litre to the price of gas, and now they have Carbon Tax 2, the terrible sequel, that will add another 17 cents. Of course, on top of that, they've added the GST, and when we add that all up, Mr. Speaker, we have an extra 61 cents per litre that will cost people in Ontario $2,300 more. Their plan has failed to do anything but make life more expensive, so why don't they finally scrap this carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, you know what's appalling for Canadians who are watching at home today? You know what's appalling is that they realize that the Conservative are blocking the clean technology manufacturing tax credit, a clean electricity tax credit, and a clean hydrogen tax credit. Mr. Speaker, at a time where the world is looking to build the economy of the 21st century, at a time where we need to fight for workers around this country, at a time that we need to position ourselves on the 21st century, you know what's the Conservative answer? Delay, delay, delay. Mr. Speaker, we need to act in the interest of this country.
That's right. The Honourable Member for Calgary-Midnapore.
In February of 2022, the Finance Minister said that deficits must be reduced and that this is a line that cannot be crossed. We all know now that this was a broken promise. When the budget was introduced, inflation went up. When the carbon tax increased, inflation went up. So when will this Prime Minister commit to eliminating inflationary deficits, eliminating inflationary spending, cutting the carbon tax so that Canadians will have lower interest and lower inflation?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, Canada has the lowest deficit in the G7. We have the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. And our AAA credit rating was reaffirmed after we tabled the budget. But what is truly astonishing, Mr. Speaker, is at a time when Alberta has been burning, when Quebec is burning, when Atlantic Canada is burning, when we are struggling to breathe here in Ottawa, this party continues to resist climate action. That is a huge disservice to every single Canadian.
Hear, hear. Member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Lowest growth out of all developed countries, Mr. Speaker. When the budget was released, inflation went up. When the carbon tax increased, inflation went up. Former Liberal Finance Minister John Manley said that these fiscal situations have to be managed, otherwise taxpayers run out of money. Well, the time has come. Canadians are out of money. So when will this Prime Minister commit to eliminating inflationary deficits, eliminating inflationary spending, cutting the carbon tax so Canadians can have lower inflation and lower interest rates, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister for Families.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Minister of Finance said it quite well. I mean, it's shocking, but I guess it's not, because the Conservatives continue to deny climate change. They continue to deny the fact that we need to act when right now here in Ottawa we are feeling the impacts of the forest fires, Mr. Speaker, yet the Conservatives continue to put their heads literally in the sand, and typically of them say, let's do nothing, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know what, Mr. Speaker, we don't do that on this side of the House. We say we need to act for today, but also for future generations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, as wildfires rage destruction across the country, we're hemorrhaging the volunteer firefighters we need. There are 15,000 firefighter vacancies across Canada, and understandably so. Our volunteers, who make up 70% of our firefighting efforts, aren't getting the recognition from this government that they deserve. I have a private member's bill to support our volunteer firefighters by increasing their tax credit from $3,000 to $10,000. So will the Liberals finally show our volunteer firefighters the respect they deserve by increasing their tax exemption?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Minister for Emergency Preparedness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member opposite for his advocacy and for his important question. Those volunteer firefighters in virtually every community across this country provide an extraordinary service. They deserve our support, and we are committed to finding the best ways to continue to support them through training, through equipment, and other supports. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, last Friday I met with a group in New Hazelton that works with adults with developmental disabilities. They told me that about half their clients are receiving letters from the CRA clawing back CERB benefits. The Liberals know full well that people living with disabilities are struggling to make ends meet, that they're twice as likely to be living in poverty, and yet instead of helping them, they're harassing them with these CERB clawback letters. So will the minister do the right thing and stand today and commit to ending the CERB clawback for people with disabilities?
Hear, hear.
L'Honorable Ministre du Revenu National.
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question, and I'd also like to say that we appreciate all the efforts made during the pandemic to help people get through this difficult period. Mr. Speaker, as we've said, at the CRA, things are done on a case-by-case basis, and we would encourage people to contact the CRA and take necessary measures. We are here to help people. Thank you very much. The Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Mr. Speaker, at the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, we often hear from witnesses that NATO plays a key role in maintaining peace and security on both sides of the Atlantic. Currently, Canada is responsible for creating a Centre of Excellence on Climate Change and Security in Montreal. With all the wildfire smoke covering Canada, this is particularly relevant. Our government's attention is on the climate, but by contrast, the Conservatives are preventing us from debating the budget implementation. Can the Minister of Foreign Affairs explain the importance of leadership on the climate? The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is an excellent question from my colleague. I'd like to thank him for his work. I just came back from the NATO meeting in Norway. We know that climate change is having an impact on our health, but also on our security. and the situation will only continue to become exacerbated with time. We need to understand the impact of climate change on defense in the Northern Atlantic. That is why Canada will be directing that new Centre on Climate Change and Security. We will help our allies, and we will be pushing the Conservative Party.
For Foothills.
Carbon tax is fueling food inflation as grocery prices are up another 10%, costing Canadian families another $1,000 a year just to put food on the table. And the Canada Food Price Report predicts that food prices will go up a stunning 34% over the next 2 years. That's not even the bad news. That does not include the implications of the Liberals' second carbon tax, a carbon tax that will add 61 cents a litre to the price of gas, which will increase the cost of food production and transportation. How much more will Canadians have to pay to feed their families when the Liberals implement a second carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his question. And he has in this House risen on a number of occasions to speak on behalf of farmers. So I have in front of me a press release from the Canola Council of Canada, Mr. Speaker, congratulating our government for the clean fuel regulations. And I quote, "We're pleased to see the CFR provides options that would minimize regulatory burden and allow canola to be used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through biofuel production," Mr. Speaker. They talk about the $2 billion of expanded canola processing capacity that our clean fuel regulations will provide to Canadian canola grocers. This member and this party are saying no to all of these investments, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Foothills.
Of the carbon tax on Canadian farmers. An average 5,000-acre farm will pay $150,000 a year in carbon taxes. Alberta ranchers who use gas co-ops are paying 60% more in federal carbon taxes than they are for the actual natural gas. 44% of fruit and vegetable producers are selling at a loss. And food bank use is up a stunning 60%, with more than 8 million Canadians using them every single month. And this is before the knockout blow of a second carbon tax. Again, how much more will Canadians have to pay to feed their families when the Liberals implement a second carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
What my colleague calls a typical farm is actually 3%, the 3% biggest farms in Canada. The projection he's talking about is based on a scenario where farmers would take absolutely no action, would adopt no good practices, would not use any new technologies to improve the agriculture to make it more resilient. This is what my colleague is referring to. While I know that farmers are very committed to reduce emissions, to have a more sustainable agriculture, to be more resilient in the case of all these extreme weather events. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable député de Beauce.
The Honourable Member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, this government is so disconnected. Many Canadian families are struggling to put food on the table. 20% are skipping meals, and the use of food banks in my riding has gone up by 30%. The carbon tax is making the costs of agricultural production go up, as well as the cost of food. Canadians are not able to pay the additional $1,000 that this government is taxing from them. So when will this government finally get rid of the carbon tax so that families can finally put food on the table again? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague is talking about the agricultural sector, and the measures that we are putting into place will help that sector like others. I have here a press release from the Canola Producers of Canada, who are congratulating the government on our clean fuel regulation, which will enable us to invest $2 billion in canola production in Canada to help to reduce the impact of greenhouse gases in agriculture and transportation, whereas the Conservatives are saying no to those investments and yes to more climate change. The Honourable Member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, unlike what my colleague across the way keeps saying, and in fact I'm surprised to not have heard that today, that Quebec is not affected by the carbon tax. Had I heard that, I would have answered that Quebec is affected by the carbon tax. The first carbon tax affected us indirectly when we imported products like produce from Ontario. Transportation and other inputs play an important role in setting costs, and the second carbon tax will affect us directly, with a cost of $436 per family, as the Parliamentary Budget Officer noted. So once again, when will the government finally axe the carbon tax? The Honourable Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, we often hear our Quebec Conservative colleagues having to defend the opposition leader's cruel economic policies. How can the leader of the opposition justify his cruel arguments where he says that global inflation is caused by the fact that low-income people needed help? How can he explain the cruelty of his advice to invest in cryptocurrencies to protect ourselves from inflation, which would have led to people losing half their savings? And how can he explain to the member for Beauce, how can he explain the fact that households don't have a right to dental assistance? The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Mr. Speaker, BP is complaining that it's being accused of engaging in exploration in the middle of a protected marine area in Nova Scotia, which is too bad for the company, which is hard for them because they're allowed to look for oil there, but they're not allowed to exploit it. But according to Radio-Canada, what the Minister of Natural Resources answered, he said to BP that if they find a lot of oil, and I'm quoting the minister here, he said that the area of the protected marine area could be redrawn. Will the minister immediately take back what he said and confirm that a marine protected area will never be rejiggered so that we can extract oil from it? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, when we formed government, only 1% of our marine areas were protected. Now it is over 30%. There is a goal of 30% by 2030, and we are currently over 14%. We are doing good work. And just last week, we also, with the Atlantic Accords, we have ensured that in Newfoundland, there will be new wind energy projects, which will be important for the economy and the environment. The Honourable Member for Avignon-Amicis-Matane-Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, it would be hard to believe this answer if this weren't a government that bends over backwards to please oil companies. BP is complaining that it can't extract oil in a marine protected area, so the government's answer should be very clear: scram and look for oil elsewhere. But instead, the minister said to BP, if you find oil in that area, well, poof, it's like magic. It won't be a protected area anymore. Problem solved. Mr. Speaker, when will this government stop facilitating climate change? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, first of all, these are only exploratory permits, not for production. And I think that's very important because it's when it's for production, there's an entire environmental assessment system that the company needs to go through. That's very important to recognize. And not only that, we will continue to protect our waters and lands. There was only 1% protected when we formed government. We are already at 14%, and we will continue to 30% by 2030.
The Honourable Member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
What do you call a Liberal finance minister with an NDP credit card, Mr. Speaker? Inflationary. But it's no joke. The Liberal spending spree is fueling inflation and putting pressure on households right across the country. With all their deficit spending, they're even making former Liberal finance ministers like John Manley and Bill Morneau blush fire engine red, Mr. Speaker. Now, speaking of fire, do the Liberals and their SpendDP backers understand that their reckless spending is torching the economy? Or do they simply want to burn it all down?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what is burning right now is the forests of our country. This is a desperately serious moment when we have had forest fires in Alberta. We have fires burning in Quebec. We have had fires burning across Atlantic Canada. We can breathe the smoke when we walk outside this very building. This is a moment for utter seriousness. It is a moment for climate action. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? In blocking our BIA, the Conservatives are blocking our clean energy plan that will help create jobs in...
Honourable Member for York Simcoe.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are on the ropes trying to pay this Liberal carbon tax, which raises gas prices by 41 cents a litre every single time they fill up. But like a 1-2 punch, this Prime Minister is now forcing a second carbon tax on Canadians, adding another 17 cents to the cost of fuel. Canadians are already down for the count, having to take on extra jobs and turn to food banks just to get by. Instead of sucker punching Canadians, will the Liberals axe the carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment. With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to read a weather alert on the Environment Canada's website. Special air quality statements. High levels of air pollution have developed due to smog from forest fires. Smoke plumes from forest fires in Quebec and northeastern Ontario have resulted in deteriorated air quality. The air quality in our national's capital, Mr. Speaker, is worse than it is in Mexico City, in Jakarta, and in Kolkata. We have all of this because of the forest fires. And what's the response from the Conservative Party? Let's make pollution free again. Not on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has been in power for 8 years, and the only thing that it has done for the environment is to tax carbon. And we see how well that's working. Anyone can look and see the wildfire smoke outside. Worse still, they want to add a second carbon tax, which will be additionally taxed under GST. They promised to plant 2 billion trees, but instead they are taking the easier path. These fruitless second taxes. When will this government finally wake up, stop reaching into Canadians' wallets, give them some breathing room, and axe the tax? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, listen, I'm always gobsmacked when I hear the Conservatives trying to tell us that they are the party of common sense. Let me refresh their memory. Denying climate change, reducing women's rights, reducing help for families, going out for dinner with far-right politicians, advising people to buy cryptocurrencies, and I could go on and on. Is that really conservative common sense? It's high time that they should do better, because this kind of common sense is not what Canadians want.
Member for Hamilton Mountain.
Canadians expect this House to be a place of debate and for political parties to disagree on issues. What they don't expect is for party leaders to delay and avoid these debates with parliamentary tricks and obstructionist tactics. That's why Canadians were appalled when the leader of the Conservatives bragged he is intentionally delaying the Budget Implementation Act.
I'm trying to hear what the honourable member is saying, but there's all kinds of noise and I really can't make it out. I want to hear what she had to say, so start over so I can see whether it's offensive or not. Please start.
Thank you, Speaker. Canadians expect this House to be a place for debate and for political parties to disagree on issues. What they don't expect is for party leaders to delay and avoid these debates with parliamentary tricks and obstructionist tactics. That's why Canadians were appalled when the leader of the Conservatives bragged he is intentionally delaying the Budget Implementation Act. Speaker, can the Minister of Tourism and Associate Minister of Finance remind this House of the significant measures the Conservatives are blocking with their immature games?
Well, the Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Member for Hamilton Mountain for that question. Mr. Speaker, for the Conservative leader to appear in front of the press and brag that his party is going to delay the debate on the BIA is the height of irresponsibility. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative delays are holding up tax deduction and benefits for working Canadians. They're holding up protections for air passengers. And shamefully, Mr. Speaker, they're holding up the codification of sanctions against Russia for their illegal war in Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, the height of the irresponsibility, shame on the Conservatives.
The Honourable Member for Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is out of touch, and yet Canadians are out of money. What's the Liberal solution? More tax. In fact, a tax on a tax. The original carbon tax added 41 cents a litre onto gas. Now this second carbon tax is going to add an additional 17 cents a litre onto gasoline. That's right. So then when you factor in carbon tax and GST, that's 61 cents a litre on gas. Wow. People who live in rural Alberta drive a lot. It's a fact of life. Traveling for work, medical appointments, and groceries. So my question is simple. When will the Liberals do the right thing and axe the tax?
That's right. Good question.
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
You know, Mr. Speaker, what's out of touch? is to delay the implementation of a clean technology, clean electricity, clean hydrogen.
Absolutely.
As there's forest fire in my riding in our province, Mr. Speaker, there are families being displaced in my riding today, and they cannot understand that a party, anyone being elected, would delay clean electricity, clean energy, or clean hydrogen. Mr. Speaker, it's not only delaying, it's irresponsible. As our country is burning, Mr. Speaker, it's incumbent on each and every one of us to act to make sure that we save, Mr. Speaker, what is left.
The honourable member for Prince Albert.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are struggling with the cost of food. Canadians are struggling with the cost of fuel. Canadians are facing a cost of living crisis. And yet, what is this Liberal government doing about it? They're adding a second carbon tax. Mr. Speaker, Canadians need a break, not a tax. 61 cents a litre is the difference between buying food or paying the rent. Why won't this Liberal government do the right thing, give Canadians a break, and axe the tax?
Yeah. The Honourable Minister for Families.
Mr. Speaker, in fact, this government is doing the right thing. We are fighting climate change and we are working to make life more affordable for Canadians. We understand that there is no future economy and there's no future for Canadians if we don't tackle the climate emergency that we are facing right now. We can actually all taste the smoke from the forest fires in this chamber right now. This is unprecedented, Mr. Speaker. So while we fight climate change, we are also putting forward things like the grocery rebate to help Canadian families with the high cost of food. We are also doing things like cutting childcare fees in half, which is saving Canadian families thousands of dollars a month.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Several years ago, a group of shady consultants gave fake admission letters to mostly Punjabi students who came here in good faith to study and be part of the Canadian family. They came here, they followed the law, they studied, many of them completed their programs, and it was the incompetent Liberal government that had accepted the letters in the first place. Now this government is kicking them out of the country, sending them home to poverty and bankruptcy for their families. Why won't this government reverse its incompetence, show a little bit of common sense and compassion, and let those who came here in good faith and are contributing to our economy halt the deportation and allow them to apply for permanent residency?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say I will not take any lessons from the member of the official opposition on immigration cases. What I want to say to this House, though, is that we want to ensure that those who are not responsible for fraud will have an opportunity to demonstrate their situation and present evidence to support their case, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, the integrity of our immigration system remains at the utmost importance. Mr. Speaker, we are actively looking at these reports on a case-by-case, and we will make good on our commitment in helping international students.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Skyview.
Mr. Speaker, during Environment Week, I want to acknowledge Canada's progress since 2015. We're reducing emissions with our emissions reduction plan and getting to net zero nationwide while creating clean jobs. We're investing in net zero emission vehicles and eliminating harmful single-use plastics. We've accomplished a lot, but there's more to do. Could the Minister of Environment and Climate Change tell this House more about our government's ongoing environmental efforts?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his question. We are, in fact, battling climate change as we have the strongest economic growth of all the G7 countries, Mr. Speaker. We've put in place measures that will create thousands of jobs in Canada, boosting Canada's economy for the coming years and for the coming decades. And we're doing that while we've reduced climate pollution by 50 million tons, Mr. Speaker, the equivalent of removing from our roads 11 million vehicles. We can fight climate change and we can have a strong economies while supporting Canadians. Unfortunately, the Conservatives want to do none of these things.
The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
Before colonialism, Inuit, First Nations, and Métis had their own forms of policing.
For decades, genocidal policies are enforced by the RCMP and local law enforcement. First Nations in Northern Ontario undertook their own community policing. This government is going against reconciliation by refusing to renegotiate new agreements. This leaves 30,000 Indigenous peoples without local police forces. When will this government provide funding to keep Indigenous communities safe?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I want to begin by thanking my colleague for her question. This is a government that has made historic investments in First Nations policing, over $860 million, which we are rolling out in communities right across the country. We know that the path to reconciliation lies in empowering First Nations and Inuit communities right across the land so that they can drive the solutions that will best protect their communities. That is precisely the work that we are committed to doing in trust, in respect with First Nations and Inuit communities right across the land. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
It's been more than 2 years since the Afzaal family was targeted and brutally murdered in London. It's unthinkable that this could happen to a family in our city, but we've seen the amazing resilience that can counter white supremacy and Islamophobia. Communities are calling for this government to combat online hate and support survivors of hate-motivated crimes. Will this government commit to establishing a national support fund for victims of hate-motivated crimes and support the NDP's Online Algorithm Transparency Act to help the Afzaal family and countless others?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for that very important question for advocacy for the community, the Muslim community in London, Ontario. The issue of Islamophobia is one that affects Muslims around this country and indeed around the world. It is an issue that we must continue to all work vigilantly upon. What I find very concerning is on today, a day when we were debating the budget, that very budget includes dedicated funds of over $50 million towards combating racism and Islamophobia. Those are the types of initiatives all members of this House need to get behind. Thank you.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for question period today. C'est tout le temps. I wish to draw the attention of members to a presence in the gallery.
I would like to draw the attention of members to the presence in the gallery of the Honourable Jeff Regan, the 36th Speaker